Welcome, everyone. Thank you for your patience as we worked out a couple technical issues. It's so nice to be back with everyone in community and to have you here for the talk today with Dr. David Gramling. Welcome. My name is Nicole Newman. I'm the director of the Max Kade German American Research and Resource Center here at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, otherwise known as IUPUI. Thank you for joining the Max Kade Center today for this book talk. We are very excited to host David in Canada, but also with us here in spirit in Indianapolis. I'd like to begin today's event by acknowledging that the land on which we gather here in Indiana is the occupied and contested territory of Native peoples. We thus wish to acknowledge and honor the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee peoples on whose ancestral homelands and resources Indiana University was built and currently occupies. I also wish to acknowledge that with its founding in 1969, IUPUI displaced a vibrant Black community in Indianapolis. And to support the communities that are investigating these legacies here at IUPUI, I'd encourage you to attend events by and send support to our Native American and Indigenous Studies program, as well as our Africana Studies program. And I'll drop links to those both in the chat presently. So before introducing our guest today, I want to take a moment to introduce the Max Kade Center. We connect with the community, we give out quite a few student scholarships, and we host about 3 to 5 events per academic year. And they somehow, in some way, all connect to German and or German American studies, or even broadly sort of concepts of language, as we'll have as our central theme today. We will have a mix of online and in-person events over the course of this academic year. You are all very welcome, if in Indiana, to come to those or travel from afar, and of course, always join us on Zoom. Our events are almost always free and accessible to everyone. If you will be in Indianapolis for the German Studies Association annual conference, I encourage you to think about attending Dr. Thomas Hokinson's talk, Queering the Avant-Garde, which will deal with the Dada movements of the United States and Europe. That's on September 29th. And on October 22nd, we have a talk by Dr. Sarah Lulay on the work of Carolina de la Motte-Fouquet, and that will be on Zoom. So everyone is welcome to attend that one, no matter where in the world you are. I'll also put registration links to that, as well as links to the Max Kade website and Twitter accounts so that you can follow us and join us at any time. Today we have about a 90-minute event. I will presently introduce our moderator, Dr. Josh Prada, who will in turn introduce our guest, Dr. Gramling. He will present on their book, followed by a discussion with Dr. Josh Prada, followed by a Q&A. So throughout the event today, please feel free to put your questions and comments that you'd like to share into the chat, and I will forward those on to Dr. Prada as the talk continues. You should know that this event is being recorded, and we will also publish that later on the Max Kade YouTube channel. So now to the main event. I am very, very pleased and honored to introduce my friend and my colleague, Dr. Josh Prada, who is an assistant professor of Spanish applied linguistics here at IUPUI. He is the associate director of the Spanish Resource Center in Indianapolis, as well as the associate editor of the Spanish as a Heritage Language Journal, and also reviews editor for the International Journal of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism. His work focuses on bi and multilingualism, and particularly on community and heritage languages, their speakers, and the emergent multilingual practices in these contexts. He has published so many articles and so many chapters in edited volumes, and has a book on contract on translanguaging and Spanish as a heritage language with multilingual matters. So I'm so happy to welcome this wonderful and very warm person, and to thank him for facilitating our conversation today. So welcome and thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Nicole. Dankeschön, Nicole. Dankeschön, Max Kade Center für heute hier sein. I'm really, really very excited to enter this conversation. First, to listen to David, then to have a chat with them, and then absolutely to integrate any questions, any issues you all in the room might have. So when I was preparing to introduce David, I of course began by writing up a little academic bio, and then I thought, yeah, absolutely, this is pretty impressive, but you can, I mean, you all are going to see what he can do. You all are going to be able to understand why he's got the number of publications he has, the wonderful, wonderful books in the last 4 years, phenomenal books, The Invention of Monolingualism, The Invention of Multilingualism, which they're going to be discussing and presenting today, work on healthcare communication, very, very exciting stuff with their own older brother. I know as well that David's mum is a scholar, a nurse, and a fantastic, fantastic person. It couldn't be any other way. I know that David brings, I don't know if it's their dog or a dog to the office. I think all these things are so much more important than the CV, which you will be able to see online. I met David the first time on Twitter a few years ago. I started following their whatever they had to say, and I'm completely hooked. I love their ideas. We've met once just for a brief few seconds, but we're best friends. He doesn't know it. That's the only issue. It is really a great honor to introduce, now with the serious stuff, David Gramling, who is an interdisciplinary scholar of multilingualism and a professor in and chair of the Department of Central, Eastern and Northern European Studies at the University of British Columbia in Canada. The view from their office is amazing. I've seen it, it's on Twitter. They received a BA from Middlebury College, a master's degree and a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in years 2002, 2008, respectively. He is the author of The Invention of Multilingualism with Cambridge, which we're going to be looking at today, The Invention of Monolingualism with Bloomsbury, 2016, which won the Book Award of the American Association for Applied Linguistics in 2018. This award is given every 2 years. Co-author, as I said earlier, of Palliative Care Conversations, Clinical and Applied Linguistic Perspectives with De Gruyere, 2019, with a big brother, Robert Gramling, who's a physician and an epidemiologist. Linguistic Disobedience, excellent title, I love it. Restoring Power to Civic Language, with Palgrave, 2019, with Julia Komska and Michelle Moyd, and so on and so forth. David has phenomenal translations, works with, through and beyond German, Turkish and English that I'm aware of. They're a scholar of multilingualism through an interdisciplinary lens. They're an educator, they're a teacher, they're a queer person, and they're a wonderful and powerful thinker. I'm not gonna give you any more details. Please enjoy the wonderful presentation, and I'll be back in about 40-45 minutes, David, when you're ready. So we'll send you a nice warm round of applause, even though you can't hear it. There it goes.
All right. Josh, that was the best introduction I've ever received in my life. Thank you so much. This has been a really lovely thing to look forward to, and I can't wait to talk with Josh. I see lots of wonderful people in the Zoom boxes, and I really hope to get to know each of you in person if I don't already. Nicole and Sandy, thank you so much for this lovely event, this invitation. This is such an exciting thing to be able to do. And before I go any further, I am coming to you from the unceded and stolen lands of the Musqueam, the Hem-Keminam speaking Musqueam people in a place now called Point Grey, Vancouver. And this will and always will be Indigenous land first. And I'm very grateful to be able to do this work on this land, and will accept the obligations of doing so as my hosts, my contemporary Indigenous hosts here explain them to me. I'd like to very quickly just say a special hello to my godmother, Ginny, who's in the audience as well. It's so great to be able to have family here, so special to me. And so I love this format because what I'm looking at is actually people's names and sometimes faces. And so I get to actually see you. Sometimes in a webinar format, you can't really see people. And so it's at least nice to be reminded while talking and thinking of your friends and your interlocutors and people who you hope to meet someday. For me, this is, in some ways, we've just been in person at University of British Columbia for about 3 weeks, and I'm wearing, work clothes and, bicycling here. And so doing a Zoom event is almost feeling a tiny bit nostalgic for me at the moment. So it's really, really interesting how that pans out. My colleague here, Biznijdim, uses the word trans-pandemic to explain the phenomena that we're all kind of going through. Are we in a pandemic? How long is this pandemic? What is the experience of it like? And so, of course, all of us, I think anyone who's been preparing for a semester in the past month or two has had 10 to 15, different types of potential anxieties about what that means. This coming to be able to speak with you today has been just something to really look forward to. And I hope everyone is doing well this morning and this afternoon. It's so funny. I really want to meet this Max Kade person someday, because Max Kade, with my first ever German class of Middlebury College in 1994, September 1994, was in the Max Kade room. And of course, at that point in my Lebenslauf, I was not able to pronounce the name Kade, so we called it the Cade room. So here we are, 27 years later at another Max Kade event. So thank you so much to the sponsors too. And originally this was intended to be an in-person event, and in the fullness of time, I fully intend to, do a Greta Thunberg and, make my way by some sustainable means to Indy to actually be in person with you. Let me see, I'm gonna keep an eye on the time here, but the wonderful thing about doing a book is that you get an opportunity to talk about it with people, and sometimes, of course, you forget what you wrote in the course of the intervening 8 to 12 months between handing in that manuscript and having, looking on Amazon one day and seeing that the book is released, which is how I learned that this book was actually out, was by going on Amazon one day and seeing that it was available. The press did not let me know. So ever since July, I've had these opportunities to talk about the book a little bit, and also to remind myself about what's in there. If you've ever written a dissertation or anything of length, you just forget what's where and what's in which chapter. And so for me, this is like kind of going back and meeting an old friend, getting to know something on a different footing. So I had an opportunity a couple of weeks ago, thanks to my colleague Irvin Malachi, to do a first kind of talk about this. The feedback I got at the end of it was that I had left a couple important things out. And so for this particular talk today, I want to focus on something that I left out of that. And it's going to be a little bit of a choose your own adventure. And I hope that either through the chat or through people simply unmuting or whatever, that we can kind of get at some of those pieces. So I'm gonna screen share now, and I do not have a script, so this is really just me talking, and I hope that is somehow amenable to you all. Can you see this this slide now? Yep. Okay. And I'm going to see if I can. I don't know how. Yeah, there we go. Is that still displaying properly? Okay. Thank you, Josh. Okay, so the part that I left out of the last time I talked about this book in a book launch, and I still don't know what it means to really launch something. I don't think I've ever launched something before. Is the epilogue to the book. And I'm sure Josh and I later, and all of us together, will talk about other aspects of the book that are of interest. But I love epilogues. I love afterwards. I love, doorknob confessions, all of those types of things where, hey, I still want to say this last thing. And one thing that I will confess to you now that I did not before at the last event was that in the draft that I submitted to the press, I said, this is the last book that I'm going to write in English about multilingualism, because I think that people have heard enough from me in English about multilingualism. And I kind of wanted to put in the manuscript of the book a promise that, okay, enough, this has been enough of an Anglo-centric, a genetic discourse, and I don't want to continue to contribute to it. So in some ways, part of the hospicing of monolingualism for me is to make commitments to essentially, spend the rest of my career, which goes to 2042, hopefully, with any luck, doing work around multilingualism that does not proceed from the kind of hypercentral discursive point of view of English. And so, though I did take that promise out of the manuscript in a moment of doubt, I still intend for this to be my last Anglophone book about multilingualism, because I don't think at the end of my career I would be able to really stomach the contradiction involved in that. So if I do write more books on multilingualism, they will be in a language other than English, and that's for me part of the fun adventure. But what I was encouraged to do by my friend Barbara Schmenk was to talk a little bit more about the epilogue to this book, and it is called The Multilingual Undercommons. And one of the one of the comments I got from my wonderful series editors, Claire Cramch and Jouhua, was that I was always being a little bit too hard on the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. For anyone who knows what that is, there's been an effort, we could date it back to the 50s even, but intensively since the 1990s, to come up with a common framework so that people who teach and learn languages can assess their competencies in those languages. And of course, at various points in the European community or union's history, it has had 24 languages, 23 languages. And so there's a lot of, it's like anything else that the European Union does. It's an infrastructural, it's just a very intricate infrastructural and institutional management endeavor, and full of industriousness, full of what we could call, with Lauren Berlant, we could call it cruel optimism, or we could just talk about a regime of anticipation. So the ways that a large infrastructure has been set up to assess and evaluate the competencies of speakers of European languages. So, and for many of us have really enjoyed and appreciated this effort, much as we enjoy anything that a group of people, a coordinated group of people, have to put in, immense, decades-long, sometimes career-long effort into producing for us. And so I had become, I think, in the course of the writing of this book, a little bit ungrateful for the work that the CEFR drafters had put in, and I don't like to be ungrateful. But at the same time, I had noticed that this Common European Framework of Reference, I'm just going to glance towards it here on the bottom right of this slide, is the scale of assessment that is on offer is A1 to B to C2 in a range of different competencies. And we'll come back to this slide in a sec. But that, it was harder and harder in conversations with people to envision an alternative, an anti-racist alternative, an anti-hegemonic alternative, a decolonial alternative, an indigenous alternative, a rematriated alternative. Any of these alternatives, ways of assessing or evaluating language capacity, languaging, how to be a languager, how to be in the world with languages. And so what I had begun to, and a lot of people have pointed toward this, Monica Heller, Alexandre Duchesne, others, Chantal Warner, that the Common European Framework of Reference, for example, tends towards a very interactional, socio-commercial set of virtues that really adheres to a particular European idea of economics, an economic exchange that goes back to the 1920s and 30s, and some people call it Ordo liberalism. And the idea is really to reduce barriers and to enable free trade, to enable the mobility of goods and capital, and to put human interaction in service of that goal. And so what happens is you get a fair bit of anti-protectionism in such a model, and that the goal is to reduce barriers and reduce, and of course that's a deeply charismatic thing to wish for, especially after 2 catastrophic murderous wars on the continent. It made sense in the 50s to kind of prioritize mobility and exchange in the hopes that, well, if, let's say Germans and French understood each other better and reduced barriers to communication, then maybe we would be able to avoid a 3rd major war on the continent. So there were clear principles behind this, but what we ended up with, in a sense, was a drastically reduced set of what it means to be a language user in the world. And one thing that the Common European Framework really does, in my view, and this is in my opinion, and others might view this differently, is to kind of take politics out of it, to take opacity out of the equation, to take cultural politics. Anything that might be controversial is removed from the CEFR. And so what I wanted to do in closing this book, and with a kind of a sense that I might never write about this topic again, in English at least, would be to just spell out a bit of an alternative. There was a time in 2014, back in my wonderful former department in Arizona, the University of Arizona Department of German Studies, where I did a little bit of an arts and crafts project, where I asked my colleagues, graduate student colleagues, undergraduate students, faculty colleagues, et cetera, to kind of design their own Common European Framework. And so we put up basically just poster board, and for every letter in the Latin alphabet, come up with a word, come up with something that for you is really a really interesting fulcrum or theme for what it means to be a languager in the world. And so my boss at the time, Professor Barbara Costa, she allowed me to do this, in the public space of the department. And yeah, I didn't have all that much success, but it was really a performance of, how to envision an alternative, one that makes sense for people and for, things like decolonial principles, and not just for commercial interests and that type of thing. So that little moment of kind of creative investigation grew into the epilogue to this book, where, just on my own whim, I really set out to populate every letter of the alphabet, the Latin alphabet, with themes and principles that I thought might be, really actually quite evocative of some aspect of language experience in the world, translanguaging experience, of being interlingual, being intercultural in the world, that were in a lot of ways either agnostic or deeply critical of some of the socio-commercial virtues that are foregrounded in the current Common European Framework of Reference. It is not meant to be a kind of smarty pants replacement for the Common European Framework. I know that that effort is full of, deep and studied experience and expertise. It is just one person's, in some ways, notional endeavor to say, we get to be creative too. We language teachers, we language learners, we curriculum designers, we get to do this too. And in some ways, the CEFR actually invites us to do this. There's documents where they say, go out and make your own. So in some ways, what I did in this epilogue was just to make my own. And I'm not particularly good at finishing books, so this was one way that that I could kind of draw this book to not an elegant close, but a close where you might not notice that it's not particularly elegant. And it closes both with this epilogue and with a glossary of some terms that I find just really, really vivid for thinking about some of these concepts. And I was really, quite taken by Lourdes Ortega's 2013 article on second language acquisition for the 21st century, where she really kind of calls on us to do interdisciplinarity in a different way in applied linguistics, and to really just, dive into some beautiful concepts that are given us from disciplines that are just really quite far afield from us. And so on this particular slide, I just wanted to share two concepts that really kind of got me going about this project. One is from Marcia Ochoa, a feminist scholar who developed this beautiful concept of localization. Her research concerns sex workers in Caracas in the way they do localization of their own experiences in a particular local context. So it's a queer imagination of the corporate linguistic traditional procedures of localizing. So I love this word of localization. So what does it mean when we localize something? When we, instead of localizing it for industrial or commercial interests, we localize it for our own psyches, our own subjectivities, our own communities, the needs and the values of the people who we admire, who we serve, et cetera, and putting people first. So that was this principle of localization. And I thought, how do you localize the Common European Framework in a way that makes sense in, indigenous territory in the Pacific Northwest, or for a West African context, et cetera, so that we're not constantly chasing these European discursive hegemonies in the hopes that it will somehow, that they'll suit our interests. The second concept that was really helpful in framing this kind of project was the concept of the undercommons. And of course, in the Common European Framework of Reference, you have this image of the commons as something shared. Well, the Black Studies scholars, Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, give us this beautiful concept of the undercommons as a space of resistance. And so I took that on as a little bit of an inspiration for saying, well, what does a multilingual undercommons look like? As the space of resistance, as a space of insisting on the primacy, but also the incommensurability of a lot of our life experiences and subjectivities when placed in a coercive relationship to institutional norms. Lots of us have been through this kind of thing with our universities, diversity, equity, and inclusion mandates, strategic planning, where all those things that we want to see our experience and desire and communities and our people represented in those documents, but most often that we get eclipsed or obscured by them. And so the undercommons is Fred Moten's, kind of answer to that, and say, even at your university, you need to build an undercommons, which will never actually be represented in the strategic planning documents of your institution, but you have to insist on forming it anyway. And so that's a bit of how I felt about this project. So for the remainder of the time, and Josh is going to stop me when you like, I just wanted to look at some of these letters and just kind of share with you what what the whimsy of it is, what the localization process is. And so here's a letter, and then I'm going to go back to a chart in a moment. But so I started with algorithm, and for any of you who know how the Common European Framework of Reference works generally, there's a 1 and a 2, and those are levels of capacity or competency. And of course, there's sub-levels, and they're all broken down into really intricate grids and things like this. I just stuck at this kind of higher level of 1 and 2. So the idea is that A1 is a kind of basic competency. A2 is a little bit more advanced on a particular a theme. And so for, many of us have been noticing over the past 20 years the ways the languages that we use, so in oral or written use, have been harvested by large corpora in order to, create automated translations, to have voice recognition software, et cetera. So the languages that we use and that we, give permission to various platforms that we use online to harvest, in fact, what I'm saying right now might very well be, harvested for these purposes by Zoom. I don't know what terms and conditions I agreed to. That the languages that we produce for free is oftentimes given over for use by these industrial interests. And one competence we might want to, put some effort into is this idea of the algorithm. So, A1 would be, can name the algorithmic platforms and technologies that currently harvest this language. So the language that I'm speaking now, if it were German or Spanish or Turkish, then it would be that language, and identify the forms and procedures through which they do so. So this is basically just a consciousness of the ways in which industrial and commercial interests are getting our language for free, whether we're typing it on TikTok or giving a lecture in a Zoom context or anything else, or on Twitter, and how those interests are using linguistic commodities, or turning our linguistic practices into linguistic commodities that then help them, generate more revenue for their own development. So A1 is algorithm. A2 is also algorithm, can describe with examples some of the effects over time of large-scale technological harvesting on this language. So that's a tougher one. A2 is really a little bit tougher, where let's say I'm working in Dominican Spanish or something like this. How do I figure out how technologies of linguistic, of AI or of computational linguistics or computational engineering have been harvesting and using Dominican Spanish in ways that actually change that language over time, right? So that's a level of capacity and consciousness that goes beyond that A1 level. A1 being where you kind of name what those platforms are. YouTube harvests my language. Here's the procedures that ensue after that harvesting is undertaken. And so this is just an example of one of the letters. And then I put keywords down here. So automation, data, supralingualism, delanguaging, AI, and digital. So for each of the letters, there's keywords that kind of point towards some of the domains in which these competencies are at work. I'm going to go back a slide and just share what I actually intend for people to do with this, which is, all of us have various, we all have an idiolect. I was listening to just a beautiful program yesterday with Uju Anya on Knowledgeable magazine, I think, where Uju Anya was talking about the idiolect and how our repertoires as language users include all sorts of different things that some of them count officially as languages, some count as sociolects or varieties, or are oftentimes not recognized as languages at all. So What I hope to do with this is to kind of open it up a little bit and to make sure that we were willing to self-assess in all sorts of different kinds of languages. So my examples here are queer Swiss German. So not just German, but also Swiss German, but not just Swiss German, also queer Swiss German, you know, these repertoires that are really specific to particular communities that we care about and to experiences that we have in the world. Or Surchik is it's not called a slang, but it's a sociolect in Ukrainian. Ukraine is an extraordinarily interesting place for language varieties, language conflict, multilingualism, and Surchik is one of those super interesting sociolects that people use that blends pieces from Western Ukrainian, Eastern Ukrainian, Russian, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, I don't know the specifics as well as I would like to. There's also the language Citizen Chinglish, which is something that Li Wei writes about, where online activists in China use kind of a beautifully ornate set of English neologisms in using Chinese characters in order to evade detection from Chinese authorities. And so words like smilance, which combine smile and silence, you know, smiling when you want to hide what you actually think. And then there's a character for that in Mandarin. And so those kind of neologisms are used in order to avoid detection from online surveillance. So these are just some examples of the types of languages that a person could decide they want to kind of self-assess in. And then you can self-assess in every alphabet letter there is, and come up with a kind of a little portrait of where you are at in a language and any given language. And then to also say, you know, where do you want to get to? You know, if I am want to be able to be an active user of, let's say, queer Swiss German, where do I want to get to? What letters do I want to attend to next? So in some ways, it's kind of a self-designed way of charting out the future of your own kind of language capacity building or language change. You know, maybe there's a letter that you want to let go of, right? Maybe there's some kind of designed attrition of your own language where you say, you know, actually, I don't particularly care about being great at this type of language. Maybe it's the language of office politics that you are no longer really interested in being particularly competent in a particular idiom. And so I guess with the remaining time, and I'm going to check here where we are. Actually, we're kind of running low, and Josh will stop me. I'll look for your wave. But I'm just
feel free to stop whenever you feel that you've shared enough. I'm happy to weigh in.
All right, great. I'm gonna do about 3 more minutes, I think, and then hand it over to you, Josh. So here's just a couple more of these letters. One is body. So we could think of the body in self-assessment of different types of competences. You know, in B1, I'm trying to get this little bar out of the way so I can read it, can describe the ways their own body, so their experience and fact of a particular embodiment, conditions the learning and use of this language. As an advanced German learner and speaker, for me, you know, there are still aspects of the embodied use of the language that I struggle with, and it's interesting for me to realize and to kind of identify those things when I think about my own capacities in that language. And B2 would be, I have strategies to remove specific barriers to the flourishing of my linguistic practice in this language, or my and my fellows' linguistic practices. So this is ways of removing what I consider to be the de-languaging barriers to the use of a particular language. And those barriers might be ergonomic, they might be spiritual, they might be accentist, they might be ratio-linguistic, they might be ableist, they might be material, vocational, etc. So B2 is being able to remove barriers to one's growth and flourishing in a particular language. And just for one more to share, just to get to, kitchen. So K1 would be, can describe the objects, practices, and phenomena present in their kitchen in this language, as well as what is found in other kitchens where this language is often spoken. So, I've always noticed that in some modes of language instruction, we skip over entire domains of practices that are either classed or gendered or privatized in a certain way. And then, sometimes you'll end up with really advanced sounding speakers who could never tell you how to do a single thing in the kitchen. And I think I'm one of those in a couple of the languages I work in. K2 would be, can describe the objects, practices, and phenomena present in their ancestors' kitchen in this language, as well as what would have been found in ancestors' kitchens where this language was often spoken. So just putting, spaces that we care about in the middle of the equation, rather than what I find the Common European Framework does, which is to really focus on certain types of spaces where commercial exchange and capital generation is taking place, rather than some aspects of the life world that we decide in our own communities are truly valuable to us. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Josh, and I'm going to unshare this screen. I'm happy to go back to any of these letters or chat about them as you like.
Awesome, David. Thank you so very much. Yeah, let me start by your idea, or letter K for kitchen. I've been taking notes as you were talking, and just picking up from kitchen, it made me think how language teaching and learning, the curricularization of languages in schools, in universities, is so tremendously disembodied. Like, language happens in the brain, language happens in the mind, language is a linguistic endeavor. And language is actually, when approached as what we do, as languaging, and when we stop being speakers of Spanish and become languages of our own linguistic repertoires in real circumstances that come from the real world, there's an embodiment and an emplacement. There's a form of extended cognition. All these things are left out of language teaching from the beginning, from like Spanish 101, French 101, or whatever language 101, up to the upper level, doctoral seminar, literature in Portuguese. So it's all about think in this language, through this language, to further develop this language, to better understand this language. Even when we go into cultural ideas, it's verbocentric. So language teaching is so verbocentric that even though it might seem like, yeah, it makes sense, it really isn't, because languaging is not verbocentric. It's an interdisciplinary endeavor. How do you feel about that, and how does that connect with? Well, I'm sharing this with you because it's a reaction to your kitchen slide. You made me think about. So yeah, maybe we're talking about the kitchen and about the home and things we do. Shouldn't we reframe or reformulate language teaching as learning to become people in that particular context, where that particular set of linguistic practices that at the moment are foreign to us start becoming our own? That's a radical reconfiguration of language teaching, multimodal, embodied. How do you feel about that?
Well, I agree with everything you said. And I just want to, the first thing that people are going to the administrator is going to ask is, how is that practicable, to learn a language in the setting in which something is needed. So the kitchen or the sewing room or the garden,
Mhm.
And this is COVID is this, this trans-pandemic moment is, I wrote the whole book during COVID. And part of the preface is just asks, what is multilingualism even going to mean when we're done with this whole shebang? So this is really the moment where we decide to reconfigure those things, and where we, in some ways, I think, stop investing in models that disembody ourselves and our learners, and that this really profound and in some ways revolutionary moment for this planet is the moment where we could really engage in some of those new models, and to just go 100% into them, because our entire labor and learning experience has been turned upside down over the past 18 months. And in some ways, we've been going about that experience quite stoically and say, oh, got to get on Zoom again, got to do this, that. And we've been accepting all sorts of radically different circumstances. And so the notion that we couldn't do exactly the same thing with curricula that begin in the kitchen, that begin in the sewing room, that begin in the garden is just patently untenable. For me, some of the best language learning moments that I've had were starting to learn Dangbe in a sewing room outside of Accra and Ghana, where my teacher didn't have a whole lot of time for me because she was also sewing at the same time. And so I would learn a little bit here and then a little bit there. And it, basically what I was becoming was a ratified participant in a space, and I was doing it slowly. I was instead of jumping the line, which I think a lot of the seal of biliteracy stuff encourages people to do, is to really just race to enfranchise a group of people with a seal. Instead of that, putting us in the kinds of social relations that actually encourage us to learn how to become a member of a community.
Now that you talk about the seal of biliteracy, I can't say I'm 100% for it. I feel it's it plays into this sloganized understanding of what a speaker of a language should be, and what a speaker of a language should sound like and should be able to do. And once that person is good enough in that named language, according to certain patterns that typically these patterns represent educated people. So once that person has been facilitated into the mainstream system, you get a little pat on the back, and it's called the seal of biliteracy. So I find that a little bothersome. It's it's a complete disregard of what multilingual people really do with their languages, and it's about rewarding a multilingual person that can behave monolingually. And I'm not sure how I feel about that kind of price. It's a little too neoliberalistic to me. How do you feel about that seal of biliteracy? Sort of, I call it an award because it's an award.
Yeah. I'm sure I would have, if at age 13, I would have gone for a seal of biliteracy. I would have been first to raise my hand to get one of those. So there, but people like Guadalupe Valdez had been casting some doubt on these things in the mid-90s already. There's, let's see, Juan Freire Veronica Eileen Valdez, Garrett Delavond, of Nelson Flores. A lot of people have been saying, look, these things are actually in some ways designed to disinclude Latinx people from the shaping of curricula that purport to refer to them. And so you suddenly have legislators and their aides, most of whom do not come from the communities about which these legislation refer, formulating a whole new set of priorities in a neoliberal idiom that most educational linguists from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s would say, hey, what are you doing running off with our bilingualism here? And of course, I want to be careful about this because there's of course, deeply committed heritage language oriented teachers and elders and community members who find great virtue in the seal of biliteracy. But they do tend to hew toward already privileged people. And that's where I think, wait, why are we offering something that gives people something to put on their resume that makes them somehow on paper more attractive to oftentimes automated job search vetting processes. Nick Sutrelu also writes about this, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. So you mentioned the idea of decolonization. I mean, there's been quite a bit about decolonization lately. I want to know how you envision, as the head of an important department, how do you envision decolonization in the language curricula in North American universities? What are the actual strategies that you see taking place, at least where you come from, where you are with your people, and what are the hurdles that you have encountered or that you feel we would encounter?
Well, thanks. Okay, I'm never ready for the head of department question, because I come to these lovely events and take a breather from head of department for a little bit and then go back afterwards.
Well, as a seasoned scholar.
No. I swear I'm gonna answer the question. Helga Thorson actually asked this question at the last one, and I was really I was really not ready for it. I think I've been in this position as head of department for Central, Eastern, and Northern European Studies at University of British Columbia for about 9 months, and about 2 of them have been in 2 weeks of which has been in person. So I'm still a little bit warming up to the job. But what I've seen so far is a German program that is deeply interested and curious about how to decolonize language learning, that sees it from faculty and graduate students who see decolonization as an absolute imperative. And in some ways, the idea is, okay, how do we clarify some of the basic terms? So the next questions that we have to ask is, to what extent were German Canadians and German Americans part of the genocidal settler colonial project? What aspects of neocolonialism are being achieved through funding structures that focus on nationalist projects? So during Trump, for example, you actually saw a resurgence of what in German is called ausländische Kulturpolitik, so foreign cultural politics, where German, nation state funders were trying to do cultural work in North America and to use soft power in new ways. And some of those ways were, of course, really trying to save the US from itself during a 4-year-long tantrum in its federal government. And so, you know, what we're trying to do is to look critically and carefully at what is funding our endeavors, you know, where does this money come from? What types of, we're going to have a conversation at our departmental meeting next Tuesday about whether, to what extent is it legitimate to use national symbols to attract new students. So if we're talking about German program, or even Scandinavian, so Swedish or Danish, are we going to use flags to attract students for that? Or how high a price are we willing to pay for retention and recruitment of students? So these are some of the things that a department head has to, you know, honestly talk about, rather than hiding it and talking about like the way the sausage is made or something like that. That is totally illegitimate thing. The one other thing that I'd like to mention about that is, of course, you know, Canadian and American universities are, you know, revising their breadth requirements or their language requirements. And one thing that I've noticed up here is that there's a tendency, I think, oftentimes among English faculty to look at Spanish, French, German and say, those are colonial languages, we're going to defund them. You know, we don't need them anymore. We need indigenous languages taught. And when I'm sitting in a heads and directors meeting, and that it seems to be this implicit Anglophonization of the curriculum based on the notion that we need to decolonize ourselves from European languages. And the predicate of that is that we're gonna actually focus on indigenous languages. Well, I want to see where the money is. You know, I want to see how many actual indigenous language programs are being funded. So instead of saying, okay, it's time to close this or that European language program, I want to know that 5-10 years from now, we don't end up with an Anglophone faculty of arts where the language departments are simply service departments for a couple of, you know, a couple of courses here and there, with actually no substantive funding for indigenous language learning. So in some ways, what I have to do is work with my my counterparts in Indigenous and First Nations and endangered languages and say, look, we want to decolonize our curriculum. We want you to get as much of the funding as we have gotten. How do we work together in order to make sure that in 2040, when I retire, that indigenous language learning is as strong or stronger than the languages for which I'm responsible? Rather than what I see happening is that English professors are often, non-Indigenous English professors are often running the show about this, and using decolonization as some type of ruse in order to shut down foreign language programs. So it's a real, I mean, thanks for the question. These are some of the things that I end up working on all the time.
I always feel like when I have this this kind of conversation with colleagues, either at my department or colleagues in other departments, the notion of decolonization is either taken as this fancy buzzword that sounds good and can get us money in some way, or it sounds like just people just don't believe in it. They don't believe that decolonization is necessary. I always wonder, and I ask this to myself all the time, what are my friends, colleagues here in my university, but every colleague I have around, you know, US and elsewhere universities, what are they willing to give up? What privileges are we willing to give up as academics, as scholars with different degrees of privilege, to make space for academics who are making scholarship from completely underrepresented backgrounds? Are we willing to give up our spaces? I don't see that happening. I don't see that happening in most cases. Most conversations that I have, even people who work in fields that look to a degree or are easy to translate into decolonizing language, like heritage language education, which is a field where I mostly work in. They're not willing to give up Spanish as an abstract thing. They're not willing to give up the standard as something to hold on to be able to measure their students' abilities. And I'm talking about people who give keynotes all the time.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the people who are asked to give keynotes, yeah, and who scatter their ideas, you know, amongst teachers and so on. So how do you feel about that, about more senior scholars giving up their seat to scholars with decolonizing ideas? Is that a form of colonization itself? Like,
is it a form of Sorry, is it a form of colonization itself?
Yeah, I mean, as they occupy these spaces, they're colonizing the space. By giving it up, they'd be opening up the space to either other forms of colonization or whatever happens. But it's, you know, it suddenly becomes no longer their own. Yeah. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, surprisingly, I've become a senior scholar. It happened kind of like overnight. And so I'm kind of one of the people that you're talking about there, I think. And, you know, I think, so I think clarifying, for me, you know, Eve Tuck's work, for example, and on rematriation, or on the idea that decolonization is not a metaphor, is just a really important corrective, as in, this is not, and maybe Barbara Schmenk is still here, this is not a slogan. It is not something that can be used willy-nilly to mean a whole bunch of stuff. And I as a senior, junior, whatever scholar, do not get to make up my own version of what decolonization is. So I think that's first, is making sure that, I mean, and of course, the word decolonial is in strategic planning documents. So, you know, you got to trace what's happening with that word and who's doing what and who's gaining which type of leverage by using it. And if it is already a privileged, enfranchised people or senior scholars, you know, that's something that really needs to be looked at very carefully. One thing that I do notice is that in the decolonial scholarship that I really, really value and go to all the time, and this is something Alison Phipps has written about really persuasively, is that that language is often in the back seat. So any theorization of language often comes a little bit late for those of us who are, you know, think about languages all the time. And so figuring out how to read a beautiful text like Eve Tuck on rematriation, 2012, and saying, well, okay, so you've mentioned language in here a couple of times, but how do we expand that into an actual program of action? As far as senior scholars ceding their space for junior scholars to do I think that that is a form of colonization? When no, I don't. I think that as soon as the agenda and the power of the arguments gains the critical power and mass that it has, and I think in applied linguistics we've passed that tipping point. I mean, I think I think people they want, you know, keynotes by Nelson Flores. Like that's what people want, and I think that's the right way to go, you know. Yeah. So I think as far as our agenda as a field, they want keynotes by Ujuanya and Nelson Flores, and that's what AAAL, you know, should be putting on the schedule, I think.
Yeah, no, and I think AAAL has done a phenomenal job promoting that kind of perspective. Okay, So before it's too late, I would like to have a look at any questions from our audience. Let me have a quick look. There's a question here from Sharon Wales. She wants to see the slide on D, disobedience, and she thought she heard you, David, say that the endeavor was unsuccessful, and she wants to know how. She thought it was brilliant. So she wants to start by having a look at the slide, the letter D. You have disobedience. Is that possible?
Sharon, I think we're going to see each other in a couple of weeks. I'm looking forward to that. Let me see if I can open this up and then get to D. And I'm not sure which endeavor I said was unsuccessful. I'd be happy to answer that. I'm just not sure which endeavor. Oh, maybe you meant the endeavor to come up with an alternate version of this.
Yes, I did, and I'm saying that because I can't get to chat anymore because of the screen share. So yes, that's what I meant.
All right, thanks, John. Well, I mean, I felt really sheepish doing this in my home department in 2013. I was worried, nobody was going to be interested, because we were all trying to get our heads into the common European framework. How do we adopt this? How do we assimilate it for our programs? And so here I was with basically markers and poster board going for an alternate and not feeling like I really had the standing to do that. But I think just deciding that as learners and as teachers with experience, we all have the standing to come up with our own, assessment criteria, that this expert discourse. And of course, people like Debbie Cameron have written about the rise of expert discourses. We're the experts. We're the people who've been doing this for 20, 30, 40 years. So coming up with our own assessments or assessment criteria can be super fun, and our students can do it. I mean, one of the fun things about this for me is these are disobedience for D is just my whim. My students could come up with something so much cooler. And it was just because I worked with Yulia Komska and Michelle Moyd on this linguistic disobedience book, our kind of Trump era book, that I thought, learning how to be disobedient, comfortably disobedient in a bunch of languages is really, for me, something of great value. So D1 can describe the techniques available in this language for non-compliance, right? Passive non-compliance, dissent, disobedience, passive resistance, escape from coercion and propaganda. If I can do those things, and I've got a D1 competency in the language. And then D2 being, has practiced these forms of linguistic disobedience in the languages they speak and describe the workings and implications of those practices. So, the fun part about this is everyone in the world can sit down with their class and make their own version of this at the beginning of a semester, and we can figure out a way in a couple of years to share what all of us have come up with. And of course, the Latin alphabet is only one alphabet you can do it with. You can do it with Adinkra symbols. You can do all sorts of stuff. So I'll on-screen share. Thank you, Sharon, for the question.
Let's go back to, if anybody does have any questions, please write them in the box, because I'm not seeing, I'm not seeing any others. Okay, I just really like the whole letters and developing these kinds of standards as building blocks. It's something I would love to see how that played out in one of my classes. There's somebody raised their hand apparently.
May I jump in with the verbal question?
Yes, please go on. Please go on. Yes.
Hey, David. Nice to, maybe I can even turn on my video. if that's okay.
Sure.
I'm much more comfortable typing in the chat, but your talk is so engaging that I have so many ideas that I can't bring it down to one question. But what I would love to hear you talk about more is what you were just talking about with we are the experts. Our students also can do this work. And I'm feeling very emotional about this because you work between literature, cultural studies, and language studies. And often in programs, you get a divide where language studies may say to cultural studies people, well, that's anecdotal. You're not the scholar of second language studies to make certain statements. Whereas I say, I started as a TA 20 years ago, and I have all of this experience. And from my observations, wouldn't this be a good idea? And you get divides within where the language, literature, culture divide. And I don't want to dwell on that, but I would love to hear you talk more about how productive this can be in talking with students, also to break down ideas of fluency. I'm always talking to students to hear what are your goals, and fluency comes up, but maybe that's not the most productive goal for the students. Talking more about proficiency or just sort of bring it down to one specific question. Can you talk more about how you really do this work with students? And is that happening in the classroom or more in advising? Thanks for such a great, inspiring talk.
Oh, it's really nice to just chat with you a little bit. I mean, Claire Crumpsch has been warning me about this problem since I was basically a teenager, where if you're gonna, the monolingualism book I wrote in 2016 was really just sticking myself right in the middle of exactly the tension you just described, the cultural studies versus applied linguistics or versus interpretive social sciences, and the methodology question. I've frankly never been much of a vigorous methodologist, and still they let me come to conferences and sometimes accept my abstracts. And so I would say really just I shared that 20-year period with you, and it's been fun to just kind of muddle through and say, no, but I think your bigger point is that we have these experiences, some of which we don't have any actionable outlet to share what we've learned. If it doesn't go into an academic paper, where does it go? So if I've had 20 years of classroom teaching experience, and as a learner, where do I get to turn some of these insights and flashes of revelation into practices? And so I don't really quite remember how I decided to go out and buy a bunch of poster board and markers and start up this project in 2013. I think it must have had a lot to do with trusting my colleagues. I had in Arizona German Studies department, I trusted my colleagues not to wield opportunistic power over me based on their discipline, based on whether they saw themselves as a cultural studies person or an applied linguist or a historical linguist. And so it took the trust of a community of people. And that's what I really enjoyed in that department. And a lot of the things that I was able to do in the last 10 years were because of the trust of it's not that one thing that I always said is at Arizona was, it wasn't that that the literary studies people necessarily understood what the applied linguists were doing, but they weren't trying to obstruct it, and that was enough. It was enough to have a little bit of salutary neglect. as far as currently, because of the job I have now, and I did propose a course based on this project up here at UBC, but because of the job I'm doing now, it's my colleague Uma Kumar who is actually teaching the course, and I get to visit it next Friday and see, what she does, what she's doing with this idea. And of course, those concepts of fluency and proficiency, those are in some ways also really vague, and they're also subject to what I learned to call hypocognition, as in oftentimes we say them and then we don't think enough about, well, what does fluency mean for this speaker, or what does it feel like to be, what is flow, or what does it mean for me as a learner of Mandarin or a learner of Creole to feel that flow? Like, who gets to adjudicate when that's happening? And so in some ways, I think just asking students to really expand expressively on what flow feels like, for them, or what does it mean to flow in a language. And that goes back a little bit, I think, to Josh's mention of embodiment. I mean, the fact that we don't talk much about embodiment and the extension of our languaging capacities in particular spaces means that we don't really ask much about what fluency even feels like. Why do people want it? Everybody says they want fluency, but why do they want it? What in their psyche, what in their spirit, what in their subjectivity makes them desire that? And if we could be doing better at that as departments, we would have fuller classes, but those are not areas that we spend a whole lot of time articulating. We just go with whatever ACTFL kind of tells us, and that doesn't work. But I share just to close, Lynn, I share all of those emotional aspects of that tension. And I have the kind of wrinkles to prove the decades of anguish they often cause when I find that the embodied experience knowledge that you have as a teacher is somehow misrecognized by your colleagues or your institution.
David, how do we rethink disciplinary boundaries between or in language studies to bridge the gaps that Lynn was talking about? What is there to be done? What kind of, I'm going to say allyships, but perhaps those are not the right terms, but collaborations, bridges, what concepts are keeping us from moving past disciplinary divides within our departments and within maybe our broad fields of work? I mean, we work in fields that are named after named languages. So that's a politicized dome within a politicized dome within a politicized dome. So what do we do to kind of like rethink these relationships and move towards somewhere else?
So the disciplines that I participate in at the moment are in a just horrible hiring and labor crisis. And the notion that we're going to be able to fix that by renaming our departments is really unlikely. I think we're in a deep contraction. I think that we are, I actually do feel that that monolingualist, Anglocentric interests, a globalist kind of this idea of Anglophone monolingual globalization, that those interests are really coming for us. They actually do want us to disappear. They would love for us to offer this or that kind of bland humanities breadth requirement course so that people like Mark Zuckerberg can talk about human rights. That's the university that a lot of these people would like to see in 20 years. And I think we face a really uphill battle here. Like I think we're really outgunned. And it's going to take the rest of my career to figure out how to you know, outflank and to build coalitions to not make such an argument for humanistic inquiry and for multilingual curricula, but because I don't think people are particularly interested in the arguments. I think we have to consolidate power and move a concerted agenda that will overwhelm those interests. I think it's unlikely. When I look at a lot of, I mean, in the book, I go into a fair bit of the artificial intelligence and a deep neural kind of language processing stuff, and the absolute kind of gold rush boomtown mentality that is driving those interests. I'm sure those colleagues are just wonderful, wonderful people. But for me, we're really heading toward a university where there is no instructed language learning whatsoever. And so I think the answer to your question is doctoral advisors, mentors need to trust their researchers, their early career researchers, hunches and intuitions about what is worth studying and what. So instead of, for myself as a doctoral advisor, trying to guard against or to guard for disciplinary boundaries on the premise that if you make your profile distinct in its disciplinary commitments, that you have a better shot at getting the job that you want. I think that's the wrong way to go. And it was, I was mentioning this to Lynn earlier, the guidance I always got from Claire Kromsch, for example, was have a good argument, you know, find something important to think about and say, and you know, you're gonna have to tough it out with some skepticism and side eye about dilettantism from this or that discipline, but you're the researcher who is responsible for the quality and legitimacy of this question that you're asking. Whether or not it suits a particular discipline has to be a secondary concern. And so, you know, she always backed me up and being in this weird floaty space between literary studies and applied linguistics. And I just think that really, really supporting you know, researchers who are in those spaces and saying, we have your back. We're not going to force you to convert your dissertation into a sociological framework or a literary framework. We're going to inquire deeply about what it is that you find valuable here and what communities you're trying to honor in this work. And so I think that the reformulation of the disciplines is going to have to happen when early career researchers are allowed to pursue their program of research without constantly being referred back to this or that disciplinary habitus.
Mm-hmm. Love that. Thank you so much, David. Well, I think we are slowly reaching time to close, but I believe Nicole might want to say a thing or two. Before she does, I want to thank you, David, for sharing your phenomenal insight and expertise. I love your ideas. I think you're amazing. And I'm pretty sure everybody has really enjoyed engaging with your ideas and with you today. So Nicole.
Thank you. I just wanted to take a moment to thank you, Josh, for your wonderful moderation and for posing such wonderful questions and for engaging so deeply with what David presented. And David, you have fans all over the chat and the list of participants and far, far beyond. So thank you for coming with your joyful presence to talk through some difficult issues and giving us some things to think about as we move forward together in this discipline. We're just so grateful that you could come join us virtually, and you're welcome in Indy anytime. So.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you, Josh. Thanks everybody for being here. I can't wait to see you in person.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all. And don't forget, we'll put this on the YouTube site so that we can have our language mined, but then also so you can share it with your colleagues. So thank you all again for coming. So wonderful to see so many people here. And thank you again, David and Josh.
Thank you, David. Thanks, Nicole. Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Cheers.